preparing, the kind of briefings of those type, take a tremendous amount of very skilled people's time to create actionable intel for someone who can make choices that are quite consequential. And we were able to see that we could actually provide pretty novel insights in a number of areas because we weren't looking at the global issues in specialized siloed ways where a lot of, say, the issues are more complex than the institutional structures were designed for. And so you would have CDC looking at disease type risks, and these kind of military groups looking at these kinds of terrorism risks, and these groups looking at cyber risks. But we see a world where something can start in one area and start to cascade across them. And so looking at the interconnection of them is actually critical to understand the world well. So we were looking at taking a deeply kind of interdisciplinary and trans-narrative perspective on this that actually resulted in novel insights into a bunch of spaces. And one of the things that started to occur during that was, this is actually what news should be. Like high-level intelligence briefings, some things should be national security or whatever, but the idea of a decision maker who gets a lot of information processing is a fundamentally anti-democratic idea, right? A democratic idea would be everyone can possibly be a significant decision maker, hopefully is actually more involved in the processes of being able to influence. But the basis of being able to make good choices is the information processing, not the information access. This is a key thing. A lot of people will share this idea that I can pull up my smartphone and have access to more total information than the president had 20 years ago, and so we've democratized information access. This is kind of a gibberish story, because even though in one way it's true, I can't read the billion search results on anything, and I don't know where the really relevant stuff is, and I can't process, all of the information. So it's not access to information, it's access to information processing to inform actionable intel that is really relevant, and there's an unbelievable asymmetry of that. If you look at the top kind of trading funds, algorithmic trading funds, and you look at the kind of financial market intel, in information processing, not just information access. Yes, they have information access you don't have of lots of different kinds of things behind paywalls and privileged information, but then they also have massive AIs that are processing, doing machine learning on tremendous databases of stuff to be able to high-speed trade bundles of complex financial instruments that front-run, other groups. Compared to the average person's ability to understand the market, we might be talking about like 10 orders of magnitude information processing difference. And the same is true when it comes to, all different aspects of power and intelligence. So to really be able to support an emergence of something like a democratic process, participatory governance, the information access and information processing to be able to understand the issues well enough to know what good informed action looks like is prerequisite. And so we started thinking, well, can we make things like this as the news? And at the same time, one of the risks that we were seeing that was driving all of the other catastrophic risks the fastest was the news landscape. And I don't just mean the few large news channels, I mean the media landscape that is the Facebook issues we were talking about, and all the YouTube recommendation algorithms plus the nature of the news and all like that. And we were seeing that people being willing to go up in arms over mask wearing or shutdown or hydroxychloroquine or systemic race issues mostly are from things they saw on their screen, not things that they experienced directly in their town. So the nature of what was happening in the media space was actually driving the breakdown of society faster than anything else was. Because in the movement from conventional to unconventional warfare, the bottom of the stack is economic warfare. That's where the real resource power comes. The back of the stack that backs it up at the end of the day, if it has to, is kinetic warfare, guns and stuff. But the front of it, where the fastest rate of change is occurring, is the narrative and info warfare that is being fought in people's minds, for people's minds, right? For the control of population. And so if we could do something to just even slow down the rate of polarization and radicalization, just take some of the pollution out of the narrative and info space, if we could show the narrative and info weapons, because they only work as well when they're covert, when they're made overt, when you get to see how the different types of spin work and how the different kinds of data manipulation work, people can start recognizing them more and recognizing how they're being affected by them and be affected less, at least have the possibility of engagement with it. And then, if you can start having even a small group of people who are really endeavoring to and getting the skills to and the information processing support to understand the world much better, plus have much higher quality conversation with each other, that group starts to have a collective intelligence that really is asymmetric to most of the rest of the population, that can start coming up with better solutions and become a strange attractor, which is the beginning of drive a cultural enlightenment that can reinstantiate the possibility of participatory coordination, governance. And so the current thing that we're building, that will almost certainly not be what it ends up being as we see what do people really respond to and what gets traction, has a few different kinds of information products together. One is something that is like news, meaning addressing critical current events. And if you look at big news organizations, they're huge organizations, right? Like, it's a lot of resource to try to do that. You've worked at BBC and big organizations. And so for most people, they would actually be best supported by having very good local news, because if they could actually make better sense of their local world, they would have more agency to do stuff about it. But local news across everywhere is just an unbelievably tremendous job, right? Tremendously large job. And being able to have news that is kind of Eurocentric and Asian-centric and whatever, and across all the sectors is a lot. So rather than pick like one domain that we're starting in, we're starting with the most consequential things across areas from a global perspective with a somewhat US-centric audience. We have to pick somewhere to start. So what that means is domestic politics and geopolitics and economies and markets, culture, technology, environment, military, all of those things, where we're looking at what are the things that we believe are tier one consequential in terms of how much they can change the overall nature of life in the world, in the coming years and decades. And being able to present that in the form of what look like briefings across, this week in the happenings that happened that are of top consequence, that doesn't have, and we don't have on the ground report networks that are anywhere near as robust as we want. We're working on building those out, but largely we're looking at groups that are reporting on it and being able to look across the whole space and be able to say, factoring left and right and different countries' perspectives and do that kind of synthesis, what is the clearest thing that we can say with confidence? And so we're looking at things that are maximally consequential and what we can say with confidence that actually is calibrated from a kind of formal process that is trans ideology, trans narrative, rather than supporting a particular political agenda or economic agenda. And it's designed to be a second simplicity, meaning a lot of complexity of research goes into it, but it's actually as simple to understand as possible. So there's a low barrier of entry of starting to get something that doesn't have narrative spin or info manipulation in it. Now, if someone wants to go deeper, and someone could easily ask, well, why would I trust that as opposed to anything else? We would say you're not trusting us because we're a particular authority. We're hoping that you trust your own sense making progressively better, and we're showing you in detail, transparently, how we do our sense making. So how we currently have it structured is that someone can see that briefing, and then there's different places they can go deeper. One of them is a under the hood feature where they can see the epistemic process, the sense-making process we used to come up with that. So what things did we read and look at? What data sets did we include? What data sets did we say we had low confidence in and decided to throw out or put a discount rate on? And what epistemic frames did we use? And so if someone wants to see that, they can. So now this is them also learning how are we making sense of the world. So they can both give us feedback on, hey, I think you misweighted this data set, or there's this other data set or frame. Awesome. But they can also be learning, I guess I could have done that. I could have looked at all of those sources. I could have applied these frames. I didn't even know some of those frames now that I know them. So they're increasing in their own sense-making capacity by seeing how we're doing it. Of course, we also want to show retrospectives of where we made forecasts or said what was going on, where we later found out that we were wrong or right, or get to show here's where we were wrong, here's where we were right. Where we were wrong, how are we updating our models? So really good transparency and earnestness in that whole process. Also, so you can do the kind of under the hood thing, you can also do the meta news thing. The meta news is, okay, so here's what we were able to find out about this topic. But that sounds different than what you read in the New York Times or the Atlantic or Breitbart or Mother Jones or RT or whatever other place you're looking at. What do they say? Why do they say that? Why did we come up with something different? What is our assessment of what they came up with? So this is actually, and of course we're not going to be able to do that for all news sources, right? We've already looked at about 1,500 news sources in our curation process. We kind of have to collapse those to ones that cluster in a similar type of narrative and then pick, some of the better exemplars of those and say, okay, so here's the narrative landscape. We'll go ahead and steelman that narrative landscape, and then we will break it down into individual propositions and say, what can we verify, what can we falsify? So we are helping people to understand the world through more of the lenses, understand why other people think what they think, even have a clear sense of it, then also understand how to empirically validate these things. Then we also show the narrative and info weapons. So we'll say, okay, so in this piece here, here's the original piece of science that they were quoting, or the original video, or that they were referencing, but then here's the way they framed it. This is Lakoff framing, this is a kind of spin. Now that same thing has spin on it over here that's of a different type. So let's explain the concept of Lakoff framing and spin, or Russell conjugation, or those kinds of narrative weapons, and say, look for these everywhere. Right? And this isn't the left saying the right's news is fake or the right saying the left's news is fake. This is saying everyone who's playing the narrative game is subject to some of the same pressures, and these are some of the tools that get used, so look for them. And also, there's some signal in all of these places. So we're not coming out as this is fake news, but there is some signal, let's try to verify it, and there is some distortion. So the goal in the meta news is that someone doesn't hear what we say and say, okay, well, that's just one other narrative with lots of narratives, that they actually get to see all the narratives and they get to see how we're making sense of them, and they get to also apply their own capacity to make sense of them. And we make explicit the narrative and info weapons so that people can recognize them more on their own. And by reifying the true parts and being able to say where something is either clearly falsifiable or we just can neither verify nor falsify, it's just conjecture or spin, we hopefully help people neither just accept nor reject any standard narrative, but be able to take a more rigorous and nuanced view across all of them. Then, of course, there's places where to understand what's going on, there's education that people need for frames, right? Like they need some history around this India-China border conflict, or they need to understand certain things around why the high altitude place where the watershed is and missile defense and whatever would be the strategic targets they are. So we'll also either curate, if there's a perfect educational piece that really does a very good job, or a few, we'll curate those, but we'll also create pieces that provide the critical aspects of education that most people didn't get, and where we also try to do kind of a Pareto optimization on this. So it's like, say we're talking here about the Facebook issues, and there's stuff trending in the news around what's happening with fake news and Facebook and whatever. So if someone's read Marshall McLuhan, they're going to understand things about media theory that other people aren't going to have, but not everybody's going to go read McLuhan. And we want to be able to reference McLuhan for media theory, but also Lakoff for media theory, and then Girard for conflict theory and other types of conflict theory, and Baudrillard for institutional decay, but also Strauss-Howe and Tainter for institutional decay. There's a lot of things where those epistemic frames give you the ability to understand stuff better, but people aren't going to go read all those books. So can we take the critical model that gives a lot of help in that book and make a 3 or 10-page essay that kind of gives the most epistemic reifying power in the easiest information compression, and say, if you want to read the whole book, please do. Otherwise, here's at least some basic stuff. Similar with the history pieces and the context pieces. So this is hoping to be able to give it easy, low barrier of entry overview of critical things with progressively deeper capacities to learn sense-making and epistemology and the kinds of background necessary to understand the world better. Now this is, in a way, this is like a big project and ambitious. In another way, it's just trying to do broadcast news and education right? which is almost going back to something. So the decentralized aspect, because this is centralized, right? The Wikipedia thing is hard to control, but you can control for a smaller team of people that have really quality epistemics and knowledge process. And we've been able to bring together a really exceptional team and are continuing to look for and grow that. It's actually hard to find people who can do this because, like, to do the core sense-making work, we need people who are capable of doing two things well. One is trans-narrative, right? That they are not so emotionally captured by a particular narrative that they can actually do a really good job of steel-manning all of the narratives. And so that's kind of a intersubjective intelligence. And then on the objective side, we need people who can do empiricism well across in an interdisciplinary way, across multiple disciplines. Because if I want to understand almost any of these issues, the lens of finance is critical, but not sufficient. The lens of culture is critical, but not sufficient. The lens of narrative warfare or politics or whatever. So there's quite a lot of environmental psychology or infrastructure. There's a lot of different specialty domains that need to be factored. So there's a lot of narratives and a lot of epistemologies. So we're looking for people internally who can do interdisciplinary and trans-narrative thinking. So then, of course, people who are specialists or do hold a particular ideology can give input, but we can take the input across those spaces and try to do analysis and then synthesis on it. The decentralized sense-making is something that we want to experiment with. We're actually looking at being able to crowdsource different projects and be able to help upregulate some of the right ones. And, you know, even where you have articles that have forums, can we experiment with architectures in the forum that incent both higher quality sense making and higher quality conversation, where those are the things that get upregulated? I think we can, and we have a number of kind of ideas on how to make architectures that really incent that, social architectures built in the digital space. And so the hope here is that, let's say that it's a small percentage of the total audience that spends a lot of time and that really has the high epistemic drive and capacity to sense make very well. Well, even if it's a small percentage of the total audience, some of those people are in everybody's friend group. Almost everybody's friend group, almost every major Facebook group or social network. If those people have really good data sources, much better epistemology, things that are addressing well all of the sides of various things, and they're learning how to do dialectic and steel-manning well, they can start to influence the spaces they're in to be able to do better sense-making. Oftentimes, the people who have best sense-making are also employed by the people who are in top institutional positions of power as strategists and analysts and whatever to be able to influence those things. So, basically, the information commons is not being stewarded. We're trying to do something to start stewarding the information commons and to make that a strange attractor of more things that will start to do that. That's why this is a nonprofit project, is we're not willing to ever put ads on, and we're not willing to put it behind a paywall that makes it not accessible to everyone. To really democratize the access to that quality of information processing has to be freely available to everyone. We also aren't willing to take any nonprofit funds that have any strings attached. So it has to be people that actually believe that increasing decentralized collective intelligence is net good for the world and authentically want to support that as a commons project.